And I'm nowhere close to desiring
It smells like syrup.
Yesterday.
In the morning,
Yeah.
when I get here, sometimes it'll smell like syrup.
Yeah.
And it smells amazing, but I don't know what it is.
Where is this coming
Yeah,
from?
what is it from?
I have no idea. I did notice it too, though.
The confidence is too far already.
It can't be that, yeah.
The only thing I can think of is maybe like coolant burning.
Isn't that usually like sugary
Yeah.
smell more, like burning sugar?
It smells like syrup to me. But
Yeah, I noticed it
I don't
too.
know what it's from. Talking about that amazing smell in the parking lot. It smells like syrup.
Smells like syrup?
Yeah, it smells like so good. Syrup. It's like a syrupy smell.
I'll have to be more attentive.
Like, I don't know what it's from,
Yeah.
but the only thing I can think of is like maybe a tree or burning coolant from the road.
Yeah, do you think a tree struck by lightning would smell like a maple tree would smell like maple syrup?
That'll save a lot of time and energy. Have a big puddle of syrup.
Yeah.
You're saying they're gonna start strapping lightning rods to trees?
Yeah.
Maple syrup.
The trees are already the lightning rod. You just need to have it spaced
Yeah,
out
right.
and isolated.
Yeah, true.
No, but add some metal in there.
That doesn't help. It doesn't hurt to add some metal.
Yeah.
And then you can like bump it up like 5-10 times the price.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Come up with like a
yeah, because it's all natural now.
name. Be like,
Yeah.
Naturally boiled maple syrup.
yeah,
Oh, that might be like evaporated.
10,000.
Yeah.
10,000
Burnt maple
lot.
syrup?
It's not necessarily slow maple syrupy process.
Instant
Natural smoke flavor. Just naturally smoked.
All right. Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Good morning to everybody online. I was kind of scrambling a few minutes ago to remembering that Stephen might be joining us on Zoom again. I was going to run in here. I had to set up the Zoom and run in here and set up the owl, but he's not here anyway. So I'm going to assume that I'll leave it open just in case, and then he'll have to join us without the owl. And then I'll just say that that's on him for being late. Good morning. All right. I jumped the gun a little bit last week when I said we were going to talk about some of those kind of pastoral implications. That's actually probably next week, which is our last week, because we do still have one more very important thing to do that we should do before we do that. So next week, which is our last week of class, we'll talk about some of the sort of ethical, pastoral implications for a lot of what we've been talking about. But today, we need to spend a lot of time, at least today, and probably I would say this whole week, on what I've kind of teased several times, which is a somewhat problematic relationship, well, problematic depending on who you ask, a somewhat problematic relationship between John 19 and much of the book of Hebrews. So let me share this. All right, so if you want to turn with me, go to Leviticus 16. We're going to read that whole chapter here in a minute. Leviticus 16. So we need to talk, we're going to bounce around. We're going to, briefly, I'm going to read you a short passage from John. Then we need to go back to Leviticus, and then we're going to go all the way forward to Hebrews and create some problems that we then might attempt a little bit to solve as best we can. But yeah, we're going to read all of Leviticus 16 here in a moment. First of all, though, so you can see, by the way, on the slide, it is finished, question mark. Is it finished? What's finished? This is where a problem arises, and maybe you'll see the problem here in a moment. Now you'll see the problem. All right. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, probably Psalm 22 here, I am thirsty. The jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. This is Jesus, obviously, on the cross. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, it is finished. Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. By the way, this will become relevant much later in this discussion, either today or tomorrow, depending on how the time goes. Who surrendered Jesus to the cross? In the language of sacrifice, it's called the supplicant, which we'll get to in a moment. So who is the supplicant? Who supplies the sacrifice? And there are some passages, and I'll mention a few. We don't have time to read them all, but sometimes it looks like the Father is the supplicant who supplies the sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like Jesus is the supplicant supplying himself. But anyway, here it says that he himself bowed his head and gave up his spirit. This is sort of a hint at the very least, a hint at the willingness of Jesus to do what he did, to go through what he went through. But this is the important part, right? That he's on the cross and he dies, and right before he does, he says, it is finished. So the reason why this becomes somewhat problematic is because this is the cross, this is the death of Jesus, and insofar as Jesus is fulfilling in some meaningful sense the sacrifices of the Levitical system, then the death of the sacrifice would not be anywhere near the end. And insofar as the book of Hebrews then shows us that Jesus is fulfilling the Levitical sacrificial system, Hebrews very clearly says that the death of Jesus on the cross is not the end. And it's not just that Jesus has more to do after he dies. It's that some of the things he does after he dies has atoning significance. In other words, and by the way, this is not just Hebrews, because we've already read in 1 Corinthians 15, and what did Paul say in 1 Corinthians 15? That if Jesus has not risen from the dead, meaning the resurrection, which comes after this, then you are still in your sins. That's atoning significance. So according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which we've already looked at, if Jesus does not rise from the dead, your atonement is not complete. You're still in your sin. So Jesus on the cross, this is before he rises from the dead or does anything else, he's already saying it is finished, and then there are other places in Scripture that very much make it sound like even the work of atonement itself isn't finished, let alone lots of other things that Jesus still has to do. So this creates a little bit of a biblical theological problem for New Testament texts in looking at what it is that Jesus means when he says it is finished, not in light of John itself. I mean, even in John, he still rises from the dead after this, right? So again, even then you could say, well, what's not finished? But in John, you could say, well, maybe John is thinking that the atoning part of this is done on the cross, and that the resurrection just has some other meaning behind it. That's not clear in John, I think, but then again, when you start to then compare it with other scriptures, it becomes very apparent that there is more atoning work to be done, even after the cross is done. This is not only important because of all of this, but I also think preaching has given off the impression that the cross is sort of the only main thing that accomplishes atonement. I think I might have mentioned this, but I have a student that was in another class that I taught on Hebrews, where we walked through a lot of this in much more detail than we can do in this class. I did a whole THM course where we just did Hebrews for a whole semester. And she said that she was at dinner with her parents one time, and that her dad had launched in this whole thing about how everything Jesus needed to do for us was done on the cross, and that the resurrection was just proof that the cross worked, but nothing beyond. And again, as we've talked about in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul in that one chapter is very clear already that that's not true. But I think Hebrews, we'll see here in the next hour, and again maybe into next week, that it elaborates upon that. Hebrews goes into so much more detail about how so much more after the cross mattered. Yeah.
This might be an ignorant question, but how much is atonement part of the Job theme? Like, why compare John and Hebrews on atonement? Like, is there precedent for atonement within John?
So yeah, I think atonement in John, clearly is a theme, but I think it's on this theme that it becomes fuzzy, right? And we'll get to this a little bit more in detail, right, on the supplicant issue. So like in John 3, when our famous John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. That's clearly an atoning formula, right? I mean, the reason that's probably the most famous verse, at least in a North American context, the most famous verse that we have is precisely because it speaks to something along the lines of atonement. So I think that, again, the reason for the comparison, though, is that from a biblical theological perspective, if we want to unpack a fuller theology of atonement, we get this sense from a verse like this, it is finished, that this was the whole end game of the whole thing. And because John is such a more prominent and like, for example, when I was a very, very young Christian, in the late 90s, I had a pastor who said to me, if anybody ever becomes a new Christian, I always tell them that to start their journey of reading the Bible, I always tell them to start in John. When I went on to Greek reading, which was my second year of Greek after I had already done all the grammar and all that, then we spent our entire first semester of Greek reading just reading through John in Greek. Part of that's just because it's simple. Like, you don't want to go send somebody to, the book of Revelation and be like, here's your first book to read out loud together or whatever. The vocabulary is just too wild, right? So part of it is that John is quite simple. It's even more simple than like Luke, much more simple than Hebrews, for example. But Mark is even simpler than John, and you could also start in Mark, because Mark's very simple. I mean, to the degree that some people even accuse him of having bad Greek, and maybe that's a tad unfair, but it's very simple. But it was like, okay, well, if we have to pick a text with very simple Greek, let's also pick one that has like this, that's more theologically robust, and John is the reason why then that gets picked. So there is this sense in which John is this wildly popular gospel that fills in all these details about Jesus and his life that you don't find in other places. And I think it's precisely because of that then our atonement theory, if it's limited to John, is then quite limited. And so I think that's why I want to have the conversation. It's not just me having it. There are other biblical theologians who have come along and said, how do we reconcile the atonement theology in John, which is present but maybe limited, with an atonement theology found in other parts of the Bible that is much more robust? So that would be another reason for comparing them. But by the way, it's not just anecdotally that some people say that whatever Jesus needed to do on the cross was done on the cross, and that there wasn't more to be done, at least in terms of atonement. A very, very prominent biblical scholar who taught at this institution many moons ago, he's former Calvin Seminary New Testament professor William Hendricks, said, Jesus knew that his work for others had now been completely accomplished. That's a very definitive statement, is it not? Completely accomplished. Throughout his earthly sojourn, and especially on the cross, he had suffered the wrath of God against sin, so as to deliver his people from it, and to merit for them everlasting salvation. The task had been brought to completion. So he doubles down. Whatever Jesus did, and this is him commenting on this verse, right? John 19:30. Whatever Jesus had to do, he was done at this moment. That's why he said that. I'm going to check one more time here for Stephen, and if not, I'm going to close this session. He's not there. Everyone say bye, Stephen. All right. Let's read Leviticus 16, though, to get a sense of the full picture of the sacrificial system. Now, this is not a full picture of the whole sacrificial system, because Leviticus 16 is just the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement does make use of lots of pieces of the other yearly sacrifices. And then there's language in Leviticus 16 that has sacrificial and atoning significance that's not found anywhere else, even in Leviticus. And so let's be clear that the order of sacrifice in Leviticus 16, we're talking about the Day of Atonement in particular, and not all of the sacrificial system that's done throughout the year. But it still tells us quite a bit about the full breadth of what sacrifices are meant to accomplish and how atonement is accomplished. So Leviticus 16:1, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron. When they drew near before the Lord and died, the Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron not to come just at any time into the sanctuary inside the curtain before the cover that is upon the ark, or he will die. For I appear in a cloud upon the cover. Thus shall Aaron come into the holy place with a young bull for a purification offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen tunic, and shall have the linen undergarments next to his body, fasten the linen sash, and wear the linen turban. These are the holy vestments. He shall bathe his body in water, and then put them on. He shall take from the congregation of the Israelites 2 male goats for a purification offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. There's lots of animals going on here. Sort of kind of unpack that in a minute. Aaron shall offer the bull as a purification offering for himself. So the bull is just for him, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots on the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. That's a bizarre reference that I will get to here in a moment, try to give you some theories as to what's going on with the word Azazel. But I can tell you this. Azazel is used 4 times in this chapter and 0 other times in the entire rest of the Bible. So here is one of the most important chapters in the entire Bible. Everybody would agree with that, right? Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, super important. It mentions this Azazel 4 times, and which is mentioned 0 other times anywhere else in the entire Bible, Genesis to Revelation. But it is mentioned again in Enoch, and the Enochic literature is not shy about what that literature thinks Azazel means. But we can still debate whether the writers of the Enochic literature interpreted this correctly. But they do offer an interpretation. They quite clearly pick what they think this means. I'll get to that in a minute. Aaron shall present a goat on which the lot fell for the Lord and offer it as a purification offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. So the 1 goat is slaughtered, the other goat, the sins of the people are passed on to that goat, and that goat is sent out into the wilderness. Aaron shall present the bull as a purification offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall slaughter the bull as a purification offering for himself. He shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of crushed sweet incense, and he shall bring it inside the curtain, and put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may shroud the cover that is upon the covenant, or he will die. He shall take some of the blood of the bull, and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the cover, and before the cover he shall sprinkle the blood with his finger 7 times. He shall slaughter the goat on the purification offering that is for the people, and bring its blood inside the curtain, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it upon the cover and before the cover. So the bull is for his own sins. The goat that is sacrificed, and its blood is spread onto the altar for the sins of the rest of the people. Thus he shall make atonement for the sanctuary because of the uncleanness of the Israelites, and because of their transgressions, all their sins, and so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which remains with them in the midst of their uncleanness. No one shall be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the sanctuary until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and for his house and for all the assembly of Israel. Then he shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement on its behalf, and shall take some of the blood of the bull and of the blood of the goat and put it on each of the horns of the altar. He shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times and cleanse it and sanctify it from the uncleannesses of the Israelites. When he has finished atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. Then Aaron shall lay both of his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the Israelites and all their transgressions, all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat and sending it away into the wilderness by means of someone designated for the task. So someone then leads the goat out of the camp and out into the wilderness. Here's an important small detail to think about. Here for this goat, Aaron is putting his hands on the head of the goat to pass the sins of the people onto the goat so that the sins can be carried by the goat out of the camp and into the wilderness. During the other sacrifices mentioned in other parts of Leviticus throughout the year, when a supplicant then brings an animal sacrifice to the priest for a similar ceremony, it's also the case that they place their hand on the head of the sacrifice that they bring, but not because of a transference of sin necessarily. It's because they're sort of entering into the presence and journey of that animal as it passes through death. It's kind of hard to explain, and we don't have time to get into it all. But the hand letting, placing one's hand upon your own sacrifice that you then, as a supplicant, bring throughout the year, is similar to this, but it doesn't provide, or it's not necessarily described as providing sort of the transfer of your sin to the animal. I think we assume that that's the case because that's the way it's described here for the goat in the Day of Atonement. But in other cases, it's more of just, again, you're transferring like your own. It's like you're identifying with the sacrifice that you deliver over to the priest as it passes through death. So, all right, verse 22. The goat shall bear on itself all the iniquities to the barren region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. Then Aaron shall enter the tent of meeting, and shall take off the linen vestments that he put on when he went into the holy place, and shall leave them there. He shall bathe his body in water in a holy place, and put on his vestments. And then he shall come out and offer his burnt offering, and the burnt offering of the people, making atonement for himself and for the people. Notice that even after he's done all this, by the way, then he does the burnt offering. And when he does the burnt offering, what does it say is being accomplished? That's still atonement. So sacrificing the goat and sprinkling its blood on the altar is not, even in this, it's not the end of the atonement. That the burnt offering, which happens after, I'll explain that in detail, a bit more detail in a minute, also is part of atonement is still ongoing through this entire process. So it's not like that's the moment where atonement happens, but then there's this other stuff that also happens to matter. It's that all of it is called the sacrifice, and all of it has atoning value. The fat of the purification offering he shall burn, or he shall turn into smoke on the altar. The one who sets the goat free for Azazel shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward may come into the camp. The bull of the purification, by the way, that's just kind of a funny detail to me. It's like he led the goat out into the wilderness before he comes back in the camp. They're like, some of that sin might have gotten on you. You got to wash all that off, right? The bull of the purification offering and the goat of the purification offering, whose blood was brought in to make atonement in the holy place, shall be taken outside the camp. Their skin and their flesh and their dung shall be consumed in fire. The one who burns them shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward may come into the camp. This shall be a statute to you forever. The 7th month on the 10th day of the month you shall humble yourselves and you shall do no work, neither the native born nor the alien who resides among you. For on this day atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you from all your sins. You shall be clean before the Lord. It is a Sabbath to complete rest to you. You shall humble yourselves. It is a statute forever. It's interesting, right? It is a statute forever. But we don't do it anymore. The priest who is anointed and consecrated as priest in his father's place shall make atonement. Wearing linen vestments and holy vestments, he shall make atonement for the sanctuary, and he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting, for the altar, and he shall make atonement for the priests and for all the people of the assembly. This shall be an everlasting statute for you to make atonement for the Israelites once in the year for all their sins. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. Now, here's an interesting part of this, by the way. If you, we're not going to read it, but if you go to the very beginning of Leviticus, the very first offering described is actually the burnt one. It doesn't come first, as we just read. It comes. You can't burn the animal before you sacrifice it and drain its blood, right? So for whatever reason, the whole book begins with the burnt offering, but on the Day of Atonement, that's quite late in the process. So a few scholars, most recently Roy McDaniel, have written whole books trying to make arguments that the burnt offering has this very deeply abiding significance that we just gloss over. And while I disagree with maybe a lot of pieces of Roy McDaniel's argument, I think the general idea that the burnt offering is massively important and that we just kind of ignore it most of the time, I think he and others like him are 100% correct about that. So first, let's talk a little bit about then unpacking this Levitical thing, and then we'll get into how this fits in with Hebrews and John and on and on. Leviticus opens with a description of sacrifices. I just mentioned very beginning of the book. The burnt offering is not the first one performed in the order of worship, but it is the first one described in the text. Some scholars argue, again, that it's a foundational form of sacrifice for the purposes of atonement, so we'll get into that. Atonement, to reiterate from our long discussion on this, is a payment for an offense that allows for reconciliation. Without atonement, we cannot draw near to God. The law describes what is owed. Sin is a failure to give what is owed. And atonement makes up for the debt acquired by failure. The biblical story then is replete with examples of God trying to dwell with his people and the failure of the people to be qualified for God's presence. By the way, I might have already mentioned this to you before, but there's lots of ways to try to talk about what we would call the story of the Bible. Right? The Bible tells a story, but it actually tells lots of stories, or there are different ways to tell the story. One of the ways we've told the story in this class quite a bit is through sort of an overarching theme of kingdom, right? We were created to have dominion and co-rule with God, and then that was broken and marred by the destruction of our relationship with God, or at least the intimacy of that relationship, and marring the image and all of that. And we walk through like kingdom as like a huge dominant story and theme through the whole Bible. That is a way, a very important way. Lots of scholars have even tried to argue it's the most important way that the story connects, or the Bible connects as a single story. I remember I asked Professor Vandenberg, who some of you might know, she retired at the end of last school year. I said, when she was a systematician, I said, when you tell the story of the Bible, what's your favorite way to talk about it? And she talked about this idea of relational intimacy with God, closeness with God. That they had it in Eden, then they lost it, and that so many things throughout the rest of the scriptures are descriptions of God's attempt to re-inaugurate some form of that intimacy, whether it's at Sinai, and remember at Sinai, initially that they could hear God's voice. Everybody could, but then they all got scared of his voice, and so they went to Moses and they were like, we don't want to hear from that guy. Like, he's scary, so how about you go way up on a mountain and just talk to him over there and just come back and tell us what he said. And it's John Sailhammer thinks that rejection of God's voice is the only reason that the law was even given. But if they had never done that, there would be no need for a law, because God's voice would just tell them every day what to do, right? So that the law was given because they rejected his voice, and I think that's a decent theory. So then same thing, like they get the tabernacle in the wilderness, and the Holy of Holies is where the special presence of God dwells among the ark on the seat, right? And then after that, then it goes to the temple, and God's special presence dwells in the temple. And Solomon, when he dedicates it, is very careful to say that the temple does not contain the presence of God, but that the special presence of God does dwell within the temple in a way that sort of provides security for the camp, for the Israelites, and on and on. And then because of their rebellion, then there's that really daunting picture in Ezekiel 10 where the presence of God then leaves the temple. So essentially just that was Professor Vandenberg's answer to me, of just this sort of ebb and flow, this back and forth of God trying so desperately to have intimate presence among his people, and them so consistently pushing him away. So that when Jesus comes, John 1, right, the Word of God comes and makes his tabernacle among us, that is Jesus fulfilling this intimate presence in a way in which it had not been fulfilled before. I just think, if you think about it in light of all of those things, it's just one of the many beautiful ways to tell the story, right? Well, atonement is about trying to secure once for all that special presence of God in a way in which, well, I would say in a way in which they had it before the fall, but you could also argue that the special presence of God we get through Christ is better than what they had in Eden. Like in Eden, they walked with God in the garden in the cool of the day and all of that. But there's something even more intimate than that I think is sort of trying to be described by our ability to have presence with God in the holy city at the end of Revelation and all of that. So that's really what atonement is about. And by the way, it describes it that way in Leviticus 16, right? The idea of atonement is so that they could have communion with God. By the way, and we'll get to this also in a second, when they had this sort of atonement take place, they also had fellowship meals with God, right? So they had grain offering and all these other offerings, and they had fellowship meals that they would get together and hang out. And in their mind, they weren't just having fellowship meal with one another. They were together having a fellowship meal with God. And that atonement made it possible for them to have the fellowship meal. There's also in places like Hosea where they disrespect the fellowship meal with God, and they're therefore rebuked for it, which is very similar to Paul rebuking the Corinthians for disrespecting the Lord's table. Exact same idea. Sacrifices are primarily then about communion with God. Even the food offerings are about the fellowship of the table. God does not need their food. It's not like Zeus or the Greek pantheon, who is like needs you to feed them, right? But it's a gift given as an aspect of a reciprocal relationship. God has blessed you, so you bring the food to the fellowship table because you are reciprocating the gift. Which again, that's lots of light bulbs going off if you ever read John Barclay. His thing is that even when we talk about gift in the New Testament that Jesus is given as a gift, that gift according, and we talked about this already in class, that gift according to like Paul, that Paul also assumed that we knew that was reciprocal, that Jesus was given as a gift, and then Romans 12, offer your own bodies as a living sacrifice, that's you reciprocating the gift. Offer yourself back to God. The sacrifices then have a very important order. The order itself matters. You could not do things out of order. First, present the sacrifice. Then the hand leaning. In the Day of Atonement, it's placing your hand on the goat so as to transfer the sins of the people onto it. Then there's the slaughter of the animal. Then the blood manipulation, draining the blood of the animal. Then there's the burnt offering after the blood has been brought into the Holy of Holies. And then the communion rites, fellowship with God. Right? Food, a meal. Communing meals with God, that sort of thing. So the supplicant brings their offering to God's house and hands it over to the priest. That's the regular sacrifices. Of course, on the Day of Atonement, it's the priest presenting the animal on behalf of the people. But if you were bringing your own sacrifice throughout the year, you're the supplicant, you bring your own. The priest brings the gift to the tables and the altars. The priest slaughters the animal outside of the Holy of Holies. And notice that, by the way, the sacrifice was not slaughtered in the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. The animal was slaughtered outside of the Holy of Holies, on a table where the blood was drained. The priest then takes the blood into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of God, and sprinkles the blood on the altar. So why blood? The life was contained in the blood, according to God. When God looks at life, God's definition of biological life, anyway, is that your life is contained in your blood. Therefore, the priest brought the life of the animal into God's presence as an offering, right? So bringing the blood is bringing the life of the animal into the presence of God. The blood then needed to be offered to God directly. You had to carry your blood, meaning the blood of the animal, as you pass sort of yourself onto the animal. You identify with the animal as it passed through death, so that its life on your behalf, it's like your life being presented in the Holy of Holies to God as that blood is then sprinkled on it. This is important. No part of the service could be missed. No part could be done out of order. And all of this is important, all of this was called the sacrifice. The death of the animal for them was not called the sacrifice. It did not refer to the death of the animal as the sacrifice. The sacrifice was the whole thing. Carrying the blood into the presence of God was probably the most important part, which was done after the animal died. Right? Now, some go so far as to say that the death itself almost doesn't even matter, other than that it's necessary to get the blood out. There are lots of scholars who have tried to almost then relegate the death of the animal to some measure of unimportance, and that's, I think, going way too far. But it is also still the case that the weight of the event was on the carrying of the blood into the Holy of Holies and not on the death of the animal itself. Right? So it still mattered that what happened after the animal was killed for them was probably seen as the harrowing part. Okay, the animal's dead. That was the easy part, actually. Draining its blood, no big deal. Now I have to go walk into the presence of God. And when I do that, I have to carry this blood in with me and sprinkle it on his altar. That's the part that, for them, was probably weighty. The tabernacle temple, then, is a copy of the heavenly sanctuary. We're not at Hebrews yet. We'll get there in a minute. But Hebrews 8:5 says that, again, the temple is a copy of a sanctuary that exists in heaven. So there is a sense in which what you're doing... Now, it's not that sacrifices are done in heaven, but the idea just that the presence of God in the temple is a copy of the presence of God in the heavenly throne room. They offer worship in a sanctuary that is a sketch and shadow of the heavenly sanctuary. Just as Moses was warned when he was about to erect the tent, the tabernacle, for God said, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." So why does Moses have to erect the tabernacle in a very particular way? Because he was given instructions that show that the tent and eventually the temple are copies of God's throne room. That's why it mattered so much. It is important to note that, the slaughter of the animal was not the defining aspect. The most important parts came after that, when the blood and the burnt offering were presented to God. The burnt offering was important, but not because of the destruction of the animal. So you might think, well, the burnt offering, what are they doing? They're just taking the sacrifice and they're just getting rid of the carcass, right? That's just the way they're getting rid of the carcass. Not the case. I mean, that is what they are, getting rid of the carcass, but that's not why it matters. It was important because it became smoke. And again, the burnt offering, when it's described, that part is described as the important part. You just have to read it carefully to see that that's what's going on. But the burnt offering was not primarily about destroying the carcass, it was about creating smoke. The smoke that rose to God in what is called an enjoyable aroma. I remember once having this, and this is maybe a bit crass, so you'll have to forgive me if you think this is crass. But I remember at one point thinking, like, why the burning carcass of the sacrifice creating this enjoyable aroma? And then I thought about the fact that, like, if you've ever been to like a barbecue joint, we all agree that it smells good. My wife doesn't eat meat, and she would even tell you it smells good. But there is this like sense in which there is this enjoyment of the aroma of the smoke as it ascends to the heavens. That God, it says in the text that God himself enjoys. And the sacrifice was completed what? With the ascension of the enjoyable aroma. So that should already be setting off light bulbs. But that becomes, I think, quite important is when Hebrews is reconstructing all of this and saying how Jesus fulfills these things. Jesus is even fulfilling the smoke ascending to the heavens, right? He's fulfilling every little piece of this. And again, according to what we just read, when I read the burnt offering and I stopped and pointed it out, what did it say the burnt offering was accomplishing? Atonement. The smoke arising in a pleasing aroma to God was part of the atonement itself. The atonement wasn't complete without the ascension. Because the supplicant places their hands on the sacrifice and therefore identifies with it, the access to God the supplicant receives is not in death, but through death. The death of the animal is not the end of the story. Access to God is granted when the blood and smoke are what? Returned to God. Both are being returned. The blood of the animal, returned to God. It's taken into the Holy of Holies where his presence is. The smoke is being returned to God. It's rising up into the heavenly sanctuary. So all of this is not about ending the life of the animal, but allowing it to pass through death and into some kind of return to God. The return to God is a very important part, because what is atonement even about? Returning us to God, right? When Jesus ascends, what does he do? He returns. All right, really quickly, this is a bit of a sidebar, but people just always ask, so I had to start including this. This slide was not in my first presentation of this material. I had to add it later. What is Azazel all about? It's only mentioned again 4 times in the whole Hebrew Bible in this passage. And there are 4 main theories offered by scholars to try to describe what it means. The 4th is by far the most prominent of the 4, but they're all around. So I'll give you all 4 quickly. First, some say that the Azazel is the goat itself, because Az means goat, and Azel means go away. So it's the go away goat, right? Get out. So this makes perfect sense on the surface. That if Azel means goat go away, and the goat is going away, then that's what Azazel means. And there are still a lot of scholars who still hold to this for that reason. But the reason why a lot have abandoned this, excuse me, is because if you are careful about the grammar in the Hebrew, the grammar doesn't work. Because you'd be sending the goat to the goat. The goat is not called Azazel. It says that the goat is being sent to Azazel. So you'd be saying the goat is going to the goat. So grammatically, it doesn't work, even if etymologically it could make some sense. Some believe that it means for removal, like you're sending the goat to Azazel, meaning to be removed. Some think that it might refer to a location, because in Arabic, Azazu, which is quite similar, means rough ground. And what is rough ground? Wilderness. You're sending it out to the rough place, the out there place. This is a minority view, but it's around-ish. And probably the most dominant, that in the grammar of the text, there's a juxtaposition between going to Yahweh and going to Azazel. And this has led most scholars to argue that Azazel is a demonic being of some kind. So I mentioned earlier that the Enochic literature interprets this Azazel concept, and this is what the Enochic literature says, which was written after Leviticus, but before the New Testament. It's in that what used to be called the intertestamental period. That terminology has kind of fallen out of fashion. It's now called the Second Temple period. But in the Second Temple period, all but one part of Enoch was written in that period. Azazel in that literature is interpreted as this demonic being. There is a sense in which that makes sense in a few ways. One, again, the grammar, that something is being given to Yahweh, meaning the blood, and then something is being given to Azazel, meaning sin, and where would sin go? Out to the wilderness where sort of the evil, the chaos, the demonic belongs, right? And then part of this makes sense too, because it would be patterned similarly to Jesus going into the wilderness, not just to be out there, but to be out there contending with what? The devil. So that Azazel himself is the devil, probably not, but that the idea that sin is sent out to the demonic that's in the wilderness place, and that Jesus models this in Matthew 4, for example, adds to this idea. I don't personally think it matters whether you land on any of these or none of them. Maybe you'll come up with your own wild theory. I just wanted to point out that this is a matter of some significant discussion and debate, and there is no what I would call consensus on this, really, necessarily. So, for whatever that's worth. All right, now, atonement in Hebrews. So we'll get as far on this as we can. Maybe done with it, I don't know. Hebrews follows the logic of atonement in Leviticus. The cross of Jesus is mentioned only a couple of times, and usually vaguely. And by the way, that is important, I think. In a book that probably cares about atonement more than any other book in the entire New Testament. That's a bit of a value statement. You could argue with it. But atonement is just, from the very beginning of the text to the very end, I'll show you in a minute, that it's just littered all over the text. And it mentions the cross like 2 times in the whole book, and vaguely both times. That not only is the cross in Hebrews not the definitive moment of atonement, like it is for lots of Christians, lots of preaching, but in Hebrews, which is talking entirely about atonement, it doesn't mention the cross very much. It's talking about all the other things that matter from the Levitical sacrifices and how Jesus fulfills all that other stuff. And at the very least, it's very clear in Hebrews that atonement is not complete at the cross because Jesus has to accomplish the other steps. Hebrews is not clear on the identity of the supplicant. I would say it's the only part, for me anyway, that's not clear. I say for me anyway, because there are others who certainly argue about other pieces of this in Hebrews as well, and you could argue about how clear any of this is. In my view, a lot of this is quite clear in Hebrews, other than the identity of the supplicant, who supplies the sacrifice. Some argue that Jesus plays the role of the supplicant himself, because he's also the priest and the offering. Those two are more clear. Who's the priest? Jesus in the form of Melchizedek, right? And who's the offering, or what's the offering? Jesus is the offering. So some say he's the supplicant also, that he does all of this. In Hebrews, though, again, I don't think it's clear. You have places, though, like Romans 8:32, where the Father is clearly the supplicant. My take on that is just that we should be really careful not to separate them too far. The Father and the Son are both willing, and I think that's probably all that really matters. So, for example, there are places all over the other parts of the Bible where Jesus is the one laying down his life, right? John 15, he lays down his life for his friends. Mark 10, he gives his own life as a ransom for many. John 10:18, he has the authority to lay down his life and take it up again. 1 John 3:16, he laid down his life for us. All of these make it look like Jesus is the one supplying himself. But, again, according to Jesus in John 10, he lays it down only because the Father commanded him to do so. In John 3, it's the Father who gave his only Son, so Father supplying the Son. And again in Romans 8:32, it says that the Father was willing to give his Son, meaning he's the one who gave his Son. He did it. So again, I just think it's both, and there's no real reason to pick it apart. That's my take. All right, key passages in Hebrews. I'm going to fly through a whole bunch of them, and they all matter. From the very beginning of the text, Hebrews 1, 3-4, he is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. Also Colossians, what language is it? Colossians 1. And he sustains all things, also Colossians 1, by his powerful word. When he made purification for sins, he what? Sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. When did he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high? After the crucifixion. He still needed to go and sit down in the throne room. And when he did that, then what happened? He became as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. There is a sense in which the act of entering the throne room after the cross, after the resurrection, and sitting down at the right hand of the Father is the place at which he then sort of becomes the once-for-all ruler over everything. And later in the chapter, and to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand, meaning a time in place when he enters the throne room, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet, which is what? A quote of Psalm 110 in reference to David. So Jesus is fulfilling the Davidic mandate to become, so go back to our story we've been telling, to become what? The king. Jesus becomes the king in total. Now, Jesus on earth, I believe, in his ministry, we've covered that a lot in this class, is doing kingly stuff. But he becomes the king in total, actually, only after he dies, ascends, rises, enters the throne room, sits at the right hand of the Father, and at that moment, he's sitting at the right hand of God, inheriting a more excellent name than the angels, and then ruling over all things until the final moment when the final defeat of Satan, sin, and death is complete, which is still yet future. We get that from like Romans 16, it's still yet future, Romans 16:20, and then of course the book of Revelation, there's more to do. But he's sitting as king now, and needed to enter the throne room to do it. Next chapter. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one, not by death, but through death. You could say that that's because of death, but he's really passing through it. He might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and those who all their lives were held in slavery by fear of death. Therefore, he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, being made human, right? And by the way, all of this, like incarnation, perfect life, death, resurrection, ascension, enter the throne room, like it's just all of that is being just dumped into various parts of Hebrews, if you're paying attention. So he's talking about death, he's talking about defeating death, that's resurrection, he's talking about becoming human, that's incarnate, it's all just being dumped in. So that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. Now, by the way, that's interesting. What do you mean become a merciful and faithful high priest? We'll get here in a moment. But you can read people like Matthew Thiessen and Nicholas Perrin, who have written recent books on like the Gospels, that show that in Jesus' life before the crucifixion, he was already doing priestly stuff, right? But Hebrews says that while on earth, he couldn't have been a priest. I'll show you in a minute. It's pretty clear in Hebrews that his priestly service began after the ascension and not while he was on earth. But again, he's doing priestly stuff while he's on earth, according to the Gospels. So there's priestly stuff in a particular light, I think, or according to a particular standard that Hebrews is talking about that required him entering into the throne room. But anyway, it's so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people, because he himself was tested by what he suffered. He is able to help those who are being tested. Now, that suffered probably is a sort of an allusion to the cross without mentioning it directly, but it's there, of course. So we've got crucifixion, we've got resurrection, we've got all that stuff all packed in. Yeah.
I didn't understand that part about the priestly stuff. So
Yes, I said we're going to get to it. The verb haliskomai, sacrifice of atonement. Now remember, when we were in Romans 3, we problematized the same phrase. In Romans 3, the phrase sacrifice of atonement appears with the word halisterion, which does not mean itself sacrifice of atonement. You have to interpret halisterion to mean that, to then put it in English, and that's what most translations do in Romans 3. The same thing is happening here with a different word that also doesn't mean sacrifice of atonement. Okay? But it comes from the same root or word group. So haliskomai means just something like pardon. So what this really says is to make a pardon for the sins of the people, or to pardon the sins of the people. So what in Greek is to pardon the sins of the people, English translators have inserted to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people, because they're interpreting the idea that pardon means that pardon means sacrifice. But if you want to be real strict about the language, it just means to pardon someone, as opposed to a full-blown atoning work.
Do you think that's like the right interpretation to make in translations, to put that interpretation on this text? Or do you think it'd be better to use the word pardon?
It's a good question. Because you kind of do an or, and I would, for myself, kind of answer that both are yes. Yes, I think it's justifiable. I think it's more justifiable here than in Romans, personally. I think in Romans, translating halisterion more closely to its strict meaning, rather than interpreting it as sacrifice of atonement, I think in Romans makes better sense, even if we can still sort of say that atonement is what Paul has in mind. I still think that it's more debatable that that's what he would have, how he would have translated it into English if he knew English, right? Whereas here, I think it's far more justifiable that it's a sacrifice of atonement, because the whole context of Hebrews is lending itself towards a sacrifice of atonement through the whole text, that it makes sense probably to translate it that way here. And yet, if it was up to me to translate it, I probably wouldn't. So I think it's entirely justifiable. I do think that's what it means. I do think that's where Hebrews is going, so I'm okay with it. And if it was up to me, I still would take out sacrifice of atonement and just use the word pardon. And let people figure out for themselves that that's where Hebrews is going, right? That's how I would do it. All right, so then we go to chapter 5. Although he was a son, this is important. He learned obedience. Now, I'm sure we've all thought a lot about this. I'm sure we've heard it preached on, or maybe you have preachers who have just avoided it, because I know someone who's she told me her pastor preached through Hebrews and then just skipped a bunch of this stuff. It's too hard to explain. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. A few things to unpack. First of all, learned obedience. Some say learned obedience simply means that he had to recapitulate the whole human experience, so that he could, when it says he has been made perfect for what? That doesn't mean moral perfection, because he was always morally perfect. He never sinned. It means made perfect for the purpose of becoming an atoning sacrifice, right? So what does it mean to be made perfect? Not moral perfection, but he was perfected into the kind of sacrifice that was necessary, and he had to live a perfect life and recapitulate the human experience for the purpose then of being the right perfect sacrifice, right? So when you have to present in the Hebrew Bible, it says that the sacrifice you present is without blemish. That doesn't necessarily, or at least I'm talking about moral perfection. It's talking about being the kind of sacrifice that stands out above all else, so that it can be a sacrifice on behalf of something else. Well, to be a once for all sacrifice for humans, you have to be the kind of human that could stand in for all other humanity, and to do so you have to recapitulate their experience, meaning live up to the experience they were supposed to live up to but failed to do so. So it's like, to atone for them, what cost them the relationship with God that caused us to need atonement? It was, again, sin getting in the way. So you have to live the whole life so that you're even qualified. In other words, just being son of God didn't qualify him. He couldn't just come down as son of God and be like, I'm here to do this, and then like 5 minutes later, he's up on a cross. He had to go through the process of living the life that we couldn't, so that he was qualified to then be offered in our place. That might have something to do with it. In fact, I would say it probably does have something to do with it. I do not think that's the whole package, though, of what it means to be made perfect. I'll get to that here in a second. Also, really quickly, I wish we had more time for this, but being designated a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, the writer of the Hebrews goes through great lengths to say two things about Jesus's, about the fact that he's not a Levite. First of all, the Levites were the tribe among the 12 tribes that were designated as the priests, right? Who did the priestly work in the sanctuary. It was the high priest, who also had to be the tribe of Levi, who could do the work of carrying out the Day of Atonement and those kinds of sacrifices. And Jesus wasn't a Levite. So without being a Levite, he wasn't qualified to do the Levitical work, even though, according to Hebrews, it's the Levitical sacrifices he's fulfilling. He was a Judahite, which qualified him to be what? King. So he's of the tribe of the kings, not the tribe of the priests, but according to Hebrews, he's both. So Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, gets around this by saying, but there was another priest in the Hebrew Bible other than the Levites that actually predates the Levites, meaning he was a priest before the Levites, meaning he was a priest that's better than the Levites. Somehow before means better. And he does this weird wordplay thing where he says, by the way, what do we know about Melchizedek? Do we know who his parents were when he was born? Do we know anything about when he died? No. Now, that doesn't mean he wasn't a regular human. He was. He had parents, and he was born in a place, and he died in a place. But the writer of Hebrews hits on the idea that we don't know those things about him. So in the way that it appears as though there was no beginning or end of Melchizedek, that there is no beginning or end to the priesthood of Melchizedek. His priesthood just goes on forever because ostensibly he does, because his story goes on forever with no beginning and no end. And because his priesthood has no beginning and no end, then Jesus can be a priest like Melchizedek, meaning a priest with no beginning and no end. Right? So I wish we had more time for that, but he does this sort of whole thing where he unpacks all of these really intricate, interesting reasons why Jesus can be a priest without being a Levite, because he's a priest in the order of Melchizedek's priesthood. And not only that accomplishes him becoming a priest without being a Levite, but that it's a better priesthood than the Levitical priesthood, because the Levites all were born, they all sinned, and they all died. And they all had to atone for themselves. Right? Like, Jesus doesn't have to go and slaughter the bull on the Day of Atonement for himself to purify himself. The priest did, Aaron did, but Jesus doesn't, because his priesthood is of a more superior form, and he never had sins that he needed to atone for in the beginning, right? Then in chapter 7, unlike the other high priests, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. Again, this is also in the chapter tied to Melchizedek. For the law appoints as a high priest humans who are subject to weakness, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has, again, been made perfect forever. Again, part of that might be the recapitulation of the human experience of being made perfect. But again, I'm going to suggest right now that I think there's more to it than that. How else can Jesus be made perfect other than just being made, acquiring for himself what he needed to be an acceptable sacrifice? How else is he then made perfect in a way he might not have been before? At least as a human. Quite a bit about the presentation of atonement and perfection in Hebrews hinges on this passage, Hebrews 7:11 through 28. And I'm just going to read this whole section to you, but it's on the slides as well. And again, these slides at the end of Thursday when we finish them, we'll go up to. If you want to revisit them later, I'll put them on the canvas. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for the people received the law under this priesthood, what further need would there have been to speak of another priest arising according to the order of Melchizedek, rather than one according to the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. Now the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar, meaning Jesus being of the wrong tribe. He's a Judahite. Judahites don't serve at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. It is even more obvious when another priest arises resembling Melchizedek, one who has become a priest, not through a legal requirement concerning physical descent, but through the power of what? An indestructible life. When did Jesus receive an indestructible life? Resurrection. How do we know that? Because before that, his life was destroyed, right? Jesus, in his moral perfection, had a physical container that was not perfect. The physical container became perfect at the resurrection, not before. So my view is that being made perfect is not just about being made perfect in order to accomplish being a worthy sacrifice, but then also after he then is killed, sacrifice, according to Leviticus, isn't over, because sacrifice is not death. Sacrifice is the whole thing. So after the death, he's also being made perfect by being given a perfect container that he did not possess at the crucifixion, but did possess at the resurrection. And all of that connects to 1 Corinthians 15, where we also, remember, have a perishable body, and we cannot enter the imperishable kingdom until we receive an imperishable body. This is crazy for us to think about, but I think this is what Hebrews is saying. The same thing was true of Jesus. That he needed an indestructible life, an imperishable body to re-enter the imperishable heavenly space. And that this made him perfect. He was made perfect enough only then to be able to re-enter the heavenly throne room to present himself as the sacrifice. Okay? For it is attested of him, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. There is, on the one hand, the abrogation of an earlier commandment, because it was weak and ineffectual. For the law made nothing perfect. There is, on the other hand, the introduction of a better hope through which we approach God. As I'll get to in a few minutes, or probably actually on Thursday, we approach God not just because Jesus died so that we could approach God. According to Hebrews, we're going to backtrack later in this whole thing, probably on Thursday, back to chapter 4. It's because he is in the throne room that we can approach God, and he only enters the throne room again because he has an indestructible body, right? So that better hope is probably maybe a veiled reference to resurrection, I would say, or the whole package, if not just one piece. This was confirmed with an oath, for others have become priests without an oath, but this one became a priest with an oath because of the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. Also, by the way, same psalm as enemies being on a footstool under the footstool of your feet, Psalm 110, but this is just a few verses later. By the way, Psalm 110:1, until I make your enemies a footstool, quoted all over the New Testament multiple times in multiple authors. 3 verses later, Psalm 110:4, you are a priest forever, only ever quoted in Hebrews and nowhere else. So it's only like, it's just the writer of Hebrews that looked a few verses down and thought, hey, wait, that part's important too, and made sure that it got in there. So on like the weird question of, if we didn't have the book of Hebrews, what would we not have? The answer is a lot. Professor Wilson, I was talking to him about that one day, and he was like, it's like someone should write a book about that. Like, what would we have, like a thought experiment. If we didn't have the book of Hebrews, what would we not have in the Christian theological tradition? And it's just a ton. It's so much stuff. Accordingly, Jesus has also become the guarantor of a better covenant. Furthermore, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he what? Continues forever. Why does he continue forever? Resurrection. Consequently, he is able for all time to save those who approach God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. How does he always live? Resurrection. For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for those of the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. So he's the supplicant. He offered himself. At least in this verse. For the law appoints as high priests humans who are subject to weakness, but the word of the oath which came later than the law appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So my argument is that all of this is building on resurrection to make it so that he lives forever and intercedes for us forever and is in the throne room forever, and then it revisits the language of being made perfect forever. So again, is perfection about him becoming the kind of sacrifice that's worthy? Probably. But is it also then about receiving an indestructible life at the resurrection so that he can enter the throne room? My argument would be also probably. I'm willing, obviously, for pushback on this kind of thing, but that's how I read this. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands. Goes back to that copy thing, right? The sanctuary was a copy of the heavenly one. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. You cannot understand that properly if you don't know the Levitical sacrifices. In Leviticus, the idea was that the priest had to enter into what? The Holy of Holies, which is the presence of God in the sanctuary. Now, Jesus enters into the sanctuary not made by human hands, the heavenly sanctuary, for the same purpose, to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. But what was the blood doing? It was there on our behalf. What is Jesus doing? He's there on our behalf. Nor was it for himself to offer himself again and again, as the high priest enters the holy place year after year without blood that is not his own. For then he would have had to suffer again and again since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he appeared once for all at the end of the ages to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. Again, most people, I think, miss this. My view, the phrase, the sacrifice of himself, does not refer just to the cross. It refers to all of the pieces. The whole thing is called the sacrifice. The cross matters, because you can't do the rest without it, but all of it is the sacrifice, because in Leviticus it's all called the sacrifice. The death, the bloodletting, the taking of the blood into the presence of God is all called the sacrifice. And just as it is appointed for mortals to die once, and after that the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time. Again, offered there would be offered for all of it, right? Will appear a second time. Even the second coming makes an appearance here, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. But when Christ had, now go to chapter 10, but when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he what? Sat down at the right hand of God. So here's the picture, I think, of what it means for him to offer himself. And again, it's offering himself in the form of the incarnation itself, right? Willing to come in the first place, live the life that we were supposed to live, die on the cross, resurrect, ascend into heaven, and what does he do when he walks into the throne room? He walks into the throne room to present his blood, which is why other parts of the Bible say that we are saved by what? The blood of the cross. Not just the death on the cross. The blood is the thing being presented because life is in the blood. So we can sort of create this picture in our minds of Jesus going into the throne room of God and saying, here is the blood that I'm presenting, like the priests had to present the blood on the altar in the Holy of Holies. Here is my blood that I'm presenting, and that God looks at that blood and says, this is good enough for all of them. They're all good. And not just for the year, they're all good forever because of the value of the blood. So I think that. So, and then why does he sit down at the right hand of God? Because he's accomplished all of that by walking into the sanctuary and presenting the blood, and now he gets to sit back on his own throne as the King of the universe, the one by whom all things are held together. Right? And since then he has been waiting until his enemies would be made a footstool for his feet, quoting again Psalm 110, for by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified. Again, all of it's the offering, not just the cross. And really the offering, the final part of the offering is what you offer. You know, he's not offering his life on the cross. He's offering his life in the sanctuary. When he walks into the presence of God with the blood and says, this is what I brought. This is my offering. That's what God is accepting, is the whole thing. For by a single offering he's perfected for all time those who are sanctified. Where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin. Meaning the need for the offering is done. All right, so I think we should stop there because we have like 4 minutes left. And so we'll get back to, at the very beginning on Thursday, this idea, though, of what it means that, according to Hebrews, there is at least a particular element of the priestly service that is only done now that he's re-entered the heavenly throne room. The writer of Hebrews is going to suggest that while on earth he could not have been a priest, even though he connects him to an earthly priesthood, Melchizedek's. He says something quite clear in Hebrews 8 about while on earth he could not have been a priest, but now that he's sort of entered the throne room, he has become the priest on our behalf, mediating for us. So we'll kind of look at that passage. I think that is just as difficult to think through the connection between that and all the priestly work he's clearly doing in the Gospels, as it is with connecting all of this not so finished stuff with him saying it is finished in John. But there is a degree to which it's not finished, and I think I'm going to try to offer maybe an inadequate response at the very end of our time on Thursday as to what I think it is finished. Does that mean if all this other stuff still had to happen? I will try to give you some kind of reason for that. But also the difference between his priestly service throughout his life and then the idea that Hebrews is saying that there's something about being a priest that he only accomplished after he went into the throne room. Maybe we'll try to reconcile that a little bit. So yeah, we'll pick up on Thursday. I know this is kind of leaving you hanging, but I like the idea of leaving us hanging with this thought that he sort of passes through the heavens, right? Insofar as the New Testament uses heavens like to just talk about the sky. And what's that, according to Hebrews 4, we'll read that passage as well on Thursday. He passes through the heavens to re-enter the throne room to present his blood on our behalf. I mean, I've thought about that image, like singing and worship and things, and just gotten like wrecked, thinking about the image of him passing through the heavens and walking into the throne room. Because when we're singing, we only even get to sing and approach the throne room in song because he's sitting there, sitting down at the throne after having done all that. So in light of that, I'll pray, and then on Thursday, we'll not only finish this off, but we'll have plenty of time then to talk, ask questions, and unpack it. All right. So whatever you're thinking, maybe hold it till then. Maybe take notes on what you want to talk about, and then we'll bring it. Bob, thank you for this beautiful reality, though, even as we try to make sense of the way the pieces fit together, that we can end our time this morning on that wonderful thought that right now, as we pray to you, our Heavenly Father, that in this very moment, your Son Jesus, our big brother, is also sitting at your right hand on the throne. He is our mediator and the one who makes it possible for us to approach you with confidence and to pray and to sing to you and to know that we are received well and loved. We know you loved us even before he came to die for us and rise for us and ascend for us, but that there's something quite meaningful has been accomplished by his work in uniting us to you and atoning for our sins and allowing us to approach you in a kind of confidence we wouldn't have had otherwise. And we just want to end our time expressing gratitude for that reality. In your Son's mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. See you on Thursday.
Thank you.